Cleve West has won 6 gold medals at Chelsea, but his heart isn't in a show garden, it's in his allotment. He's a man who feels at one with nature, encourages others to feel the same, and believes in the power of nature to heal. So, when he was asked to design a garden for patients in the spinal injuries unit of Salisbury's General Hospital, he didn't hesitate.
I've worked on an idea which drew upon the metaphor of the spine itself. You arrive at the hospital broken, but you leave the hospital, whether or not you're fixed physically or not, you leave the hospital in a much better place.
Here was a project which would challenge any garden designer. And if Cleve West thought Chelsea was demanding, creating a garden out of nothing, a garden that would help the healing of body and mind, was something else.
I've heard stories of people just bursting into tears when they go into the garden for the first time after spending like 4 or 6 months inside the ward. Now I really understand how everyone can benefit from gardens.
In a sort of through-the-keyhole moment, the bookshelves in Cleve West's studio hold clues to this most laid-back of garden designers. There are books by Piet Oudolf, the Dutch landscape gardener revered by almost every designer working today. One on Japanese gardens called Space and Illusions. A pocket guide to manures for the wartime garden. Books on the sculptures of Robert Adams, Anish Kapoor, Barbara Hepworth. Elsewhere, the Hymenopterist's Handbook, useful in the allotment. And this, a CD of the funeral service of Horatio Chappell, who was killed by a polar bear during an expedition to Svalbard in Norway in August 2011. He was 17. Horatio's father was a surgeon at the spinal injuries unit at Salisbury's General Hospital. Horatio himself was a volunteer and 3 weeks before his death, sketched a scheme to create a garden for spinal injury patients who spend months, sometimes years, lying flat indoors with no connection to the natural world. Horatio Chappell's mother and father, Olivia and David, were determined to make Horatio's dream a reality.
Horatio was coming at it really with the eyes of the young, and his own experience that his default position was always to be outside. As a family, we love being outside. And he understood how important that was to how he felt and could see that if he was in hospital, he would feel like that. But I think the reason that this had such an impact was that it was that eyes of the young, so he didn't see all the barriers, which is what we saw. So we just saw red tape and struggle and difficulty and problems. But he, with his enthusiasm and problem-solving mind that he had and sort of engaging personality, he convinced us, first of all, my husband and I, and then started to convince even the hospital, the chairman of the trust. He got him down to have a look at the site, and really made us see what could be possible and how it would have such an extraordinary benefit to patients.
But now Horatio was gone, and in their quest to do something in his memory, fate led the Chappells to Cleve West.
Olivia didn't know that I'd already had a connection with the spinal unit because one of my family spent a whole year there So I used to go up and down the A303 to see him, you know, for 6 months or so while he was in like almost a prone position looking up at the ceiling. And it was awful, and he really didn't have a place to go outside. So when they got in touch and talked about having a garden, I thought, well, that's a project I've got to be involved with. The site wasn't particularly easy. No hospital site is easy. This one in particular was surrounded by a car park. The building wasn't particularly attractive, and the only one view was, you know, over to the Clarendon Hills. And so I was very aware that it'd be good to see it from the patient's perspective. So we did this little stunt where I was wheeled around in a wheelchair and lying down on a bed just to get a sense of what it felt like. Didn't really give me any clues as to how to design the garden, but it really helped me understand how vulnerable you feel in a wheelchair, especially because you're letting someone else push you around and you feel that momentum, and you feel every bump in the garden. So I knew that we were going to have to go with a material, this resin bonded gravel for the path, which I've never really particularly liked before, but I knew it had to be the case for this. It was an interesting experience, but I found it quite a challenging design. The other thing we had to take into account was the fact that we had to have 2 metre wide paths, big open spaces, so it means less room for plants. So it was challenging, but it was an enjoyable experience as well.
There would eventually be other gardens at spinal injury units around the country, all named after Horatio Chapel, and those who created them, some of the country's top designers, would face an identical challenge: how to transform a tiny, usually neglected space into an all-year-round garden.
I've worked on an idea which drew upon the metaphor of the spine itself. You have 2 broken spines. The path is actually dissecting these 2 spines, leading to a complete spine. It's a metaphor for the fact that you arrive at the hospital broken, but you leave the hospital, whether or not you're fixed physically or not, you leave the hospital in a much better place. These spinal shapes are represented by low dry stone walls. Once you've got those, then everything else pretty much falls into place. That shows you where your flower beds can be. The way I work is to try and do things on a small scale. And if you keep trying to do a different idea and you keep getting drawn back to the same idea, it means you're pretty much onto something. And then so this is the actual plan itself. The finished plan, so you've got these wide paths and wide open spaces, because the garden actually has a number of art fairs and plant fairs, so we need sort of wide spaces for people to congregate in. And this is the apple arch, and these are all the beds. So once you've got your structure of the low retaining walls, everything sort of falls into place.
Now that they had Cleeve West, David and Olivia Chapel were confident they could make their concept work, and that the spinal unit in Salisbury would be a template for others. For Olivia, it would be an opportunity to see the process of garden design up close and personal.
Oh, it's been the most wonderful journey for me to see that creativity. It really is watching an artist at work. A multi-layered artist, and particularly in this sort of garden design where really Cleeve led the ideas. He listened to the patients, he listened to the doctors, the medical staff, the administrators. We talked to so many people, and then he started to create the design. And really the premise which came from Cleeve was that this should be an all year round beautiful garden. So with the idea to try to get away from a low maintenance garden to something which would give joy no matter what month of the year somebody came outside. We're working with a very vulnerable group of seriously unwell patients, so there's lots of constraints on the garden as well, which designers wouldn't normally have when they're designing perhaps in a private garden. But to be able to assimilate all of that and to process it and turn it into something which was so creative and so positive, while still being able to put their own twist on things, is really a sort of incredible testament to their design skills.
Curiously, Cleve West had already given some thought to the garden as healer. In 2008, he designed a garden at Chelsea for Bupa. The idea was to create a safe environment for dementia sufferers and their carers. It won a gold medal. So by 2011, he'd gained some experience of the types of layouts and materials that could work in any design for Salisbury. The hand sketch became a computer-aided drawing, and the design was fixed.
This is the view over to the Clarendon Hills. Clarendon Way is here. That's literally the only view that you've got. There's hospital buildings here, you've got car park here. So when you're sat down in a wheelchair, you do get this glimpse of the countryside over here. And this is the Apple Arch, and these are the beds. Obviously this sort of lots of resin bonding gravel everywhere for that lovely smooth surface. And we've got another view from the other side. So the Apple Arch helps to screen off some of the buildings this side of the garden. These are the dissected spinal shaped low walls leading to the complete spine here, and that's the path that goes through. So lots of planting space around to either side of the path in which to fill up. So these are the box balls, which much larger now, but still plenty of space for perennial planting, and a mixed native hedge around the outside as well.
From design to doing it, now the first Horatius garden had to be built. What do we know about Cleve West? That his mother was born in Calcutta and came to the UK at the time of partition in 1947. She found work as an extra in films being made at Pinewood Studios. Theirs was a loving, extended family among the first post-war Anglo-Indians in the country, and he feels her death, unexpectedly in 2010, keenly.
My mother was from India, and I think there is a little bit of influence. I certainly am drawn to the more exotic side, and very early on in my garden design career I was always drawn to architectural plants and all the exotica that people love in their gardens, particularly in urban gardens. I'm re-evaluating that now because of biodiversity loss and all the pickle we're in globally. I'm having to have a rethink on the way we plant, the way we look at our gardens and how we use them.
What else? That his grandfather, his father's father, Cyril Barton West, who fought in the First World War, was a gardener in what Cleve calls the Edwardian manner, all clipped lawns and salvias. He keeps a picture of him in Egypt in World War II on his computer. And that Cleve might have ended up as a sportsman rather than a garden designer, had it not been for Great Aunt Ivy.
I used to work for a fine art publishing company, and in my lunch break used to go and see dear old Aunt Ivy in Chiswick and used to help her in the garden, and before long I got completely hooked on gardening and started up my own garden maintenance business and worked for her just one day a week. And when she died, she left me a little bit of money, and I invested that in a course at Kew Gardens with John Brooks, which really opened my eyes to the garden. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a garden designer. Suddenly being in a profession which was just you can completely immerse yourself in plants. I was hands-on. I did design and build, so once I got the design ready I used to go out and build it, and I think those are the happiest days. Now being stuck in here drives me absolutely potty, so any chance to get out on site and roll my sleeves up, I'm there.
Aunt Ivy and his teachers at Kew would have been proud of Cleve West's successes at Chelsea. Few of the nation's garden designers can claim 6 golds, much less two Best in Show, the only garden designer to have won that particular award in consecutive years.
Chelsea has been good to me without a doubt, but I'm a one-man band pretty much with part-time assistants, so you have to sort of drop everything for 9 months or so, or a year even, to fulfil Chelsea and get it right on the day, because there's so much involved. So it's a double-edged sword, really.
You sense that there was always a feeling that these show gardens were not quite Cleve. They made his name, and for that he's grateful, but there was something wilder going on inside his head. In this, Cleve West was ahead of his time. When at the Millennium he proposed a book on his newly acquired allotment, lovingly tended with his partner Christine, an artist, his publishers were unenthusiastic. But Grow Your Own took off, organic was the buzzword, and then, in a pandemic year, applications for allotments rose exponentially. COVID-19 made us re-examine the relationship between humans and plants.
Every single thing in this world is connected, and the human being is just, we're really honest about it, we're a spanner in the works. Everything we do has a negative consequence for nature unless we really think hard about it. There was a point where I really wanted to give it up and concentrate on other things. But then I realised that if I don't do it, then someone else is going to do it less sensitively. So you have to be aware of not just what we want out of the garden, but what actually is it already in the garden. And all the wildlife, all the plants, they all have a function, and they all have a right to be here as much as we do. So I think gardening in a much more sensitive way is going to become more fashionable, if you like. I hate that word because it implies it's just here for a short term. This is serious. This has to be long term. We have to really seriously understand what we're doing to the planet and how we can mitigate all those negative effects. And it worries me, but I'm fortunate. I'm glad that I'm in the profession I am now, because we can do something to make people more aware. I went to a garden the other day and the buttercups are right up here in the middle of a planted bed. Complete accident, but neither of us had the heart to pull them out because the bees are enjoying it. And so that's one little example of how views are changing. We have to reset this sort of aesthetic barometer, if you like. We have to, just because it's called a weed doesn't mean it's not welcome anymore. When I go down to the allotment, I've left some parts of it to grow wild, and it's fascinating watching how things grow into each other and have their own mind, if you like. And we always come in and we start ripping everything out and say, do this, do that. But it's amazing when you just leave things. But it's really difficult. I mean, even now, knowing what I know now is still difficult. So you imagine people who don't know anything about this, they're not going to buy into this very quickly. So we've got to try and educate ourselves and try and pass that message on.
So here is this contrast. Keeper of an allotment on the one hand, garden designer on the other. In the one, he's as close to nature as he can be. In the other, he's dealing with clients who have their own aspirations about formality. And in those gardens, this one is in Normandy, he likes to test and tease the sense of place.
I don't know if I fully understand it myself, but a lot of it comes from having a gut feeling about the place. And for instance, I'm doing a job in the Cotswolds where there's a courtyard as you go into this medieval sort of manor house, and it was completely run down, and it had jasmine and it had hydrangea petiolaris growing up one side, and it just had so much atmosphere. But the house was falling down, so they had to restore it. And now all that's gone. And I'm really frightened about not being able to capture that, because it takes time to really get back that atmosphere. And so I'm slightly concerned about that. But having seen it, I know what I'm trying to do. It's not like I'm guessing, because I've seen it and I know it works. So I've been fortunate in that respect. With other gardens where you're just presented with a blank canvas, it's so much more difficult.
Garden design is about shapes, about accessibility, planting and textures, and about being tactile, for which Cleve West uses 3D objects, whether it be in Normandy or in his Chelsea garden or at Horatio's garden in Salisbury. Here is art, sculptural trees and plants, and architecture, putting a heavy mass into a small space, and construction, building concrete columns in Cleve's 2011 Chelsea garden for the Daily Telegraph. These are all parts of Cleve West's design language, recognisable in the many private gardens he's created, and now in the Healing Garden at Salisbury General Hospital. There are now 7 Horatio's gardens around the country, built in memory of 17-year-old Horatio Chappell, who was killed on an expedition to Norway in 2011. He could not have imagined that the idea he conceived shortly before his death would be taken up with such enthusiasm by a group of Britain's top garden designers. The London Garden at Stanmore is newly minted from the drawing board of Thomas Stuart Smith. It's still bedding in, but it's already providing a link with nature for the patients of the Spinal Cord Injury Centre at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital. And all this was built and opened during the pandemic. In fact, there are 2 gardens, one where patients can meet their families, the other a calmer space, and both wrap around the wards. The garden at Stoke Mandeville is the creation of designer and Chelsea gold medal winner Joe Swift.
It was a really challenging site. Sloping, completely exposed from a major walkway from the car park to one of the main entrances. So there was a complete sort of sense of exposure to the world, even though that area connected to the spinal unit specifically. So first thing to do was thinking about screening it off, making it feel like a garden, that sense of seclusion, but also then levelling it, which meant a lot of wasted space because of this slope. So it was all, how much can we dig out, which has knock-on implications into all the services underground, which has to be kept going because it's a hospital environment. It was sort of daunting, but I sort of quite relished the challenge, actually, being an ex-landscaper. I love sort of levels and retaining walls, and actually it's sort of slightly more interesting than a perfectly flat site, because it steps up and you can build the planting up and create that sense of being enveloped in planting. The views from inside were really important all year round. I knew it was going to be a sort of riot of colour and textures in summer and spring. That's never a problem, but I really wanted to extend it into the autumn and the winter as well. So scent was very important. They gave me carte blanche as far as the sort of planting was concerned, but it was just trying to create a real garden that really marks the seasonal changes and has highlights at certain times of the year, but really feels alive. I think a lot of hospital gardens and potentially sort of municipal spaces are quite simple in their planting, evergreen structure, and there's not a lot of seasonal change. So that was important. And then biodiversity, bringing birds in and butterflies and bees and really making it feel alive. So the planting sort of had to hit those notes as well. I think it's the most important garden I've ever designed. I've designed a lot of private, residential clients, but to design a garden that connects with so many people, there's the patients, there's the family, the friends, they're going through terrible times in their life. Recovery is incredibly important, but I just love to see it populated. If I go up there and I see patients out there and people using the space how I designed it to be used as well, with little pockets of areas for seclusion or smaller gatherings, and then larger areas, and it's just great. And I put my heart and soul into the design. I poured over the way it would work and the way it would look and the way it would feel, and three-dimensionally sort of look from different angles, and I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. And yeah, it's a sort of humbling thing to do.
The effect of these gardens upon their designers has been significant. They've become more than ordinary commissions. Tom Stuart Smith, Joe Swift, Andy Sturgeon, Bunny Guinness, Sarah Price and James Alexander Sinclair all keep in touch with the head gardeners of the gardens they've designed, and they go back as often as they can. James Alexander Sinclair says he cries every time he returns to the garden he made in Glasgow.
I usually say that it's the most important garden that I've ever designed in my whole life, which I think all of us who have designed Horatio's gardens feel exactly the same about the whole thing. Because it hits you in so many different ways. In the reason, the connection between something that could happen to any of us, that fast, your life would change so much. You get hit by a bus, you fall off a horse, you fall off a bicycle, you're in a car crash, you have a stroke, all of these sort of things. Suddenly you cannot walk. Your life has changed immeasurably and forever. You can't go home because there's 3 steps you have to go. You can't go, and Horatio's garden addresses all of that in such a sort of friendly and welcoming way. It's the idea that it's a very sort of British thing. It's the idea you can cure everything with a cup of tea and a flower, which to a certain extent you can, really. It's a very, very obvious and visible way that gardens can heal people. Every time I go to Horatio's now, I cry, because the garden makes me cry, because it means an awful lot to me. Obviously, it means a lot to other people. This is a garden that most of the gardens that I do are for really nice people. They have them and their family and their friends and all this sort of. This is a garden that is going to be appreciated by thousands of people who've been affected by something as remarkable and as tragic as breaking your back and not being able to walk. So, affected by this horror of paralysis, will go through this garden and it will make them feel better.
10 years after it was opened, Cleve West feels much the same about Salisbury, and he's still going back on and off to tweak the design.
You really do start noticing now, it's really morphed quite significantly, in terms of how some plants are quite not invasive, but they sort of have a bit more of the upper hand against something else. So we're having to pull out and rearrange and be more considered about the whole thing, and it's quite challenging sometimes, especially for the head gardener, Stephen Hackett, because he doesn't want to upset me in terms of my original vision. But I'm encouraging him, saying, look, don't be frightened, just go in there and just pull that out and do this, do that. He's been amazing, and we've got a fantastic range of volunteers as well to help. But yeah, gardens change all the time, so it's never finished, which is something is unnerving, but it's also something I really enjoy as well, because it means that it never gets dull.
Cleve remains in close contact, and so we work as a partnership, if you like, a loose partnership. He comes down several times a year and we chat on the phone and email and all the things one can do nowadays. So he's always aware of what's going on in the garden and how it's evolving. And I know he's said on numerous occasions how he likes the fact that this garden in particular is one that he can come back to and see it as it develops, which isn't always the case with commissions that he's done.
The original Horatio's garden thrives under head gardener Stephen Hackett. The design, the one Cleve West sketched on tracing paper in his studio, has worked for patients and for plants.
The design of the garden is obviously primarily there to make it as accessible and therefore enjoyable as possible for the spinal injury patients, and we need to bear that in mind at all times. So I would say The two things are keeping pathways and so on open. We tend to allow things to spill a bit onto pathways so that it softens the edges, but obviously they need to be clear so that people in wheelchairs and beds can move around. And the other thing which is fundamental to the planting design in particular of the garden is that it provides as much interest across 12 months of the year as we possibly can, because a patient who's in the spinal centre has no choice. They might be here in the middle of January, they might be here in the middle of summer as we are now. So we try and make sure there are things for them to enjoy, even if it's a quieter time of the gardening year.
When Cleve West started work at his drawing board, no one knew that his design would have to cope with the pandemic, the tension between containing COVID-19 and letting those laid up for months see family and friends.
Obviously the garden is a construct, it's an artifice as any garden is, but nevertheless, we have wild birds nesting in the garden, we have butterflies and bees, and it just feels a much softer, more natural sort of space, and there is an ever-growing body of evidence for the beneficial effects of that for not just hospital patients but for all of us. And I think over the last 18 months through the lockdown, anybody who had a garden or a park that they could get into immediately understood, and I think that's given me and our volunteer team and others a bit more of an insight into just how important it is for the patients, because it's something you perhaps in more normal times take for granted rather.
Ten years on, and it's possible to look back and think about the design decisions Cleve West took at the start of designing Horatio's garden at Salisbury's spinal unit. The materials he chose, the trees and the plants. At first, he thought low-maintenance shrubs would work, but then he changed his mind.
The planting is really mostly perennials. We thought about using shrubs and making it a low-maintenance garden, but the whole point about perennials is that it's really seasonal. You really enjoy the seasons. It accentuates all the seasonality of the year, and you get all the different colours, and it changes all the time. So, and plus the fact it draws the insects in. And if you have insects, you have birds. So it's a completely vibrant garden in that sense. When I first started designing the garden, I was really keen to avoid having raised beds, because that's such a cliche in a garden for anyone with a disability. And so I had the paths were sloping down into the space, and so the beds were naturally raised. But very quickly, after having spoken to patients at the hospital and having spoken to my cousin's husband who'd had the accident, I knew that that was you just can't have slopes. Anything that's going to make someone vulnerable is not going to make them feel comfortable. So we had to make it flat, unfortunately. But the spinal dry stone walls help to give a sense of some sort of height, and the perennials and the trees, they really do. They just give you that sense of intimacy once you're in the space. You are looking for sort of gradations of scale in terms of trying to make contrast and repetition of form throughout the garden. And we've done that with some box balls and some trees. And the box balls are actually getting quite large now, and I'm itching to actually reduce them in size, because the scale is slightly a little bit disconcerting to me. Either that, we let them grow into trees, which is quite neat. I haven't suggested that. I must suggest that to Olivia. All those things help to provide interest, and throughout the year it gives structure to the garden. And so even in the winter, when all the perennials have died down, then you've still got that structure which is interesting for people.
"10 years. Much has happened, but the memory of the day they opened the garden in Salisbury remains."
It felt extraordinarily emotional. And here is so connected with Horatio, and it was only a year after we'd lost Horatio that we opened the garden. And the before and after impact was so enormous, because it was the first time we'd done this. Nobody really knew how it was going to turn out, so people were just overwhelmed, and we had all the patients coming out in beds, the staff in tears. The emotion was just phenomenal for all of us. For Cleve, for Martin who built the garden, everybody who'd given their time, the volunteers who planted it, had been such a collective effort. And that really has replicated through the next gardens. Every time we open, it's this extraordinary feeling of emotion.
For friends of Horatio Chapel, the creation of these gardens is a wonder. For Charlie West, who was at school with him, it's especially poignant.
As spinal patients, we're in hospital for so long. I was here for 7 months. So it's great to have a space where you can flee the clinical confines of the ward and get out and have a nice space where you can meet friends and family and have a catch up away from what is potentially it's an uncomfortable environment on the hospital ward. So it's slightly less awkward out in the garden. I think he'd be hugely proud of what they have achieved, because it is such a brilliant space. Actually getting a chance to get out and about into the outside world, into nature, it can be hugely beneficial for health and mental well-being, and it's a different type of prescription to what we get on the ward, where you can actually get out to nature and engage with the sounds of the birds and the water and everything. It can be massive. It makes such a huge impact, so I think he'd be very proud of what they've all achieved.
In all this, the question in Cleve West's mind has been, who are we gardening for? Created to calm the minds of spinal injury patients, is his design in Salisbury a clue to the role of the garden in a post-pandemic world?
I've heard stories of people just bursting into tears when they go into the garden for the first time after spending like 4 or 6 months inside the sterility of the ward. So it's powerful stuff. It shouldn't be underestimated. I think it's one of the most important gardens I've done, for sure, and it's really helped me understand the value of gardens, because up until then, to be quite honest, I've always thought of garden design as a bit of a cop-out, really. Doing gardens for people who are fortunate enough to be able to afford them. But now I really understand how everyone can benefit from gardens.
The amazing thing about Cleve was that he showed that you could bring extraordinary garden design right into the heart of NHS hospitals. When you're surrounded by very challenging buildings, you can still create an incredible sanctuary that takes people away from their moment, from their ill health and all of the struggles that they're having, and creates a haven where you've got beautiful planting, but you've got birds and you've got wildlife, and everybody benefits. And that's down to Cleve's vision and the way he showed us that you could actually do this in this type of environment.
They enthralled and captivated us, but like the lives of their authors, they often have another, deeper story to tell. Our fascinating new series Wonderland continues on Sky Arts Thursday night at 7.
Next time, in his role as a Vice President of the Royal Horticultural Society, James Alexander Sinclair is at the Tatton Park Flower Show, helping to judge the Young Garden Designer of the Year competition. The 5 finalists are setting out on a path which James himself trod 40 years ago.
I, for the first 20 years of my life, thought the gardening was something really boring that my parents did. And then finally, you get it, and you realise the power that this thing has.
Encouraging new talent, blogging and vlogging from his garden in Oxfordshire, overseeing a busy design practice, and doing it all with endless optimism and humour, James Alexander Sinclair is a human dynamo. But the quips and the jokes hide the thoughtful side of a designer who considers a brief carefully and lays out every new garden with an eye to the future.
We have to not just incorporate what you can see, but what is in the mind's eye. That's a sort of an illustration of the optimism of gardeners. You plant something under whose branches you will never sit.